discussing forgiveness, the new easy application, and additional important updates. So with that, we're going to go ahead and kick off. Just as a quick reminder, everything will be recorded today. You may submit your chats and your questions through the Q&A and the chat feature in the program. With that, we're going to go ahead and pass it off to Ron Nipping. Ron?
Hey, thanks, Sam. And thanks for everyone for joining us this afternoon, and especially our appreciation for you choosing Raymond as your trusted partner as we travel together through this wild ride. And also, I'd like to just take a moment and congratulate you all on your tenacity and resolve to get through this COVID challenge and thrive on the other side. And especially thank you for keeping your employees employed. The number of families that you have made such a positive impact through these efforts are countless. Today I'll be joined by Tom Szymanski, John Pridnia, and Susan West as we go through a number of subjects. And we'll be discussing the impact on forgiveness from the PPP Flexibility Act of 2020 that was just passed 2 weeks ago, the 2 new loan forgiveness applications that it spawned. Also, the interim final rule to the 3rd and 6th interim final rules that were dated June 17th. We'll also talk about the FTE safe harbor and the impact on forgiveness, why the EZ form might not be as easy as it sounds, the 8 and 24 week covered periods and the impact on strategy, the new safe harbor date of December 31st, 2020, and the different eligibility payroll costs and also the amounts paid to business owners for both the 8 and 24 week period. Now, he says it's a wild ride to date, but that ride is not yet done. It's been almost a month since the last FAQs have been issued. We did get that IFR after the Flexibility Act was given, but we are leaning forward in our seats, waiting for the next series of FAQs. If you remember previously, the SBA and Treasury would say the FAQs were coming out soon. Now they are saying that they'll be out promptly. We all hope it means quicker. They'll be at the end of this. You'll be able to see some of the uncertainties that we're still facing, but a lot of the questions we've had have been answered. And as always, Raymond is committed to providing additional guidance when it's available and the strategies to implement those guidances. I'll be followed by John Pridnia as he talks about the Flexibility Act and the easy application. John?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Yes, for the next 3 slides, I'm gonna go through kind of the highlights of the PPP Flexibility Act of 2020 that was recently passed. A number of pretty significant changes. So we're gonna talk a little bit about the additional time, the reduction of the requirement for dollars in payroll costs, talk about some changes in the area of the FTE counts, maybe a little bit more on the loan, details of the loan, some of the changes that occurred there, the use of PPP money along with other stimulus funds or stimulus programs, definitions that came out a little bit on max compensation details for owners and non-owners, and then talk about the brunt of the whole pass, the act of the easy application. And as Ron said, not so easy, but maybe easier than the first one. So let's dive into the details. So we got another 16 weeks. It went from 8 weeks to 24 weeks. So from the June 30 to the December 31st, 2020, anybody who received that loan before the enactment, you can continue to use your 8 week, and we'll discuss a little bit deeper dive later about why that might be a very good decision for those who are either substantially complete or complete within their 8 week period. The next detail was the reduction in payroll costs. So it went from 75% requirement for payroll down to 60% for payroll. And they did clarify, this is very important, that there is no cliff provision where if you spend less than 60% of your loan proceeds on payroll, that means it eliminates any forgiveness opportunities. They did define that there is no cliff, so that's good news. FTE changes, a couple of changes here. So the additional FTE exemption, if the borrower is unable to document in good faith an inability to return the same level of business activity which was in place on February 15, 2020, due to some reason beyond their control, which was generally government regulated, a mandate shutdown, a essentials only, and not being in an essential business. So those types of things, that guidance says that they will not be in jeopardy of losing their ability to meet the FTE standards. So if you're in a restaurant business, for example, this may be one of those opportunities if you're still on lockdown or not able to come back to full compliance because you're at 60% or 50% occupancy. Extended the deadlines on the rehiring exemptions as well. As we talked about, it was June 30, you had to restate your FTE counts. Now that goes out to December 31st, 2020. A lot of questions still remain on that. We're still trying to figure out is what happens if you spend your money by September 30. Is it the FTE count as of September 30, or do we go out to December 31st? So further clarification to come on that. Can you give me next slide? So extending the maturity, the loan itself, to the extent that the amount that was originally loaned does not reach a forgivable amount, so there's a remaining note left over. It was 2 years. It got extended to 5 years, and that 5 years still carries a 1% annual interest rate. They did eliminate the 6-month deferral of payments under the PPP loans, replacing it with deferral until the date on which the amount of forgiveness was determined and then remitted to the lender. So no longer 6-month deferral, but you do have some deferral during that period of forgiveness calculation. If the borrower does fails to apply for forgiveness within the 10 months after the last day of loan forgiveness, i.e. the earlier 24 weeks from the origination or December 31st, you must then begin to make payments on principal, interest, and fees on the PPP loan. So important to make that application for forgiveness, at least within 10 months. Next item is the use of the funds along with other programs. So you may be familiar with the CARES Act deferral of the employer's share of FICA tax. You could not take advantage of that if you were going to do the PPP loan. They did clarify that you can take advantage of both, and it is still available. So to the extent that you have a large amount of payroll, that 6.2% FICA employer share can get deferred until the end of next year, and then a year later on the other half. They did also come out with clarification on the maximum forgivable compensation for the 24-week period as it relates to non-owners. That's $46,154, and owners, that's the lesser of what they got paid last year, 2.5 months, or $20,833, which equates to the $100,000 cap that we've all been hearing about. And I think there was a question up there, and I've lost it on here, but I think that kind of asked a question about, in part, about what the max comp was. You said you knew what the max comp was, but what happens if you reach that amount? Do you put that money back into the PPP loan account and then refund others? There's a number of things to that, but I'll take it very quickly. You really don't have to create a separate fund, so you don't necessarily have to put money back in, but you certainly know that you've got a cap on those employees, and if they're owner employees, let's say, the owners know they can't get any value for it, why would they not want to maybe shift that value to payroll that is needed to get things back up and running or meet the forgiveness test? So I hope that answers your question there, Siobhan. Next page. So then the easy application. So basically, if you are the 3 items on here, if you're self-employed with no employees, you did not reduce annual salary or hourly wage rates by 25% and didn't reduce FTEs, or you as a borrower did not reduce annual salary or hourly wages by 25% and you were unable to operate at the same level due to the restrictions we talked about earlier. If you meet those definitions, you can use the easy application for forgiveness. As we said earlier, it is not really easy, but it is a lot less lengthy, and you'll see some of the applications when Tom talks about it. But you'll also not have to submit a Schedule A, which can be quite difficult as well. You still have to provide spending documentation as required under the regular application, so payroll costs, rents, ledgers, those sorts of things. And you don't have to provide the FTE documentation, but you still should maintain it should any questions arise in the review of your calculations and in your application. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom, who's going to do a little deeper dive into the applications themselves.
All right, thanks a lot, John. All right, so we're just going to start off with a little bit of discussion about forgiveness. I think, one of the most common questions is, well, how do I maximize forgiveness? What are the things I need to be worried about during, this process? And I think, at a high level, the recent changes are gonna lessen the pressure I think that a lot of people were feeling with how am I going to spend this money in the time frame I have on the expenses, and do I need to get creative or stretch, where I'm looking for? And I think, the reality is between the option to go to 24 weeks and the reduction of payroll to 60%. I mean, I think those two things are greatly going to reduce that pressure, on most borrowers to hit that number. I think the non-payroll costs, especially, those that were in higher rent areas where this was a struggle for, some of those things are really going to ease up some of those pressures, and some of that a lot of our questions were based upon, well, can I do this? Can I do that? Really just with the additional weeks and the 60% changes, I think that's going to allow most people to get to at least the gross forgiveness calculation in pretty good shape, as long as, their business doesn't continue to stay down. The other really two things that you really need to keep an eye on is the salary reduction and the FTE reduction, and probably more so the FTE. The salary reduction of 25, or you're allowed a 25% reduction in someone's rate, hourly rate or salary, as compared to the first quarter. So, it doesn't seem like a lot of people went the reduction route. They more went, towards the full-time layoff type route to kind of control expenses. But you have to remember that on the FTE reduction ratio, that's a straight reduction to your forgiveness. So in a real simple example, if you had 100 employees, and then during the, that was your prior period, and then your coverage period, you had 50. If you didn't get back to 100 on either your average or a safe harbor, then you could see up to a 50% reduction on your forgiveness spend amount. And that's really the one that I think you really have to keep a close eye on, especially through these changes, to make sure you've got a good handle and strategy on how you're going to avoid any reduction to your loan forgiveness. So to dive a little deeper into the FTE, there's really two methods. One is a check the box method, where if you qualify under one of three options, you can check the box and you simply don't have any reduction. You get 100% of your payroll or of your forgiveness cost applied to your loan. And there's three ways that you can check the box. The first is, it's just a real straightforward. If you had no changes between January 1st and through the end of your coverage period, you had no reduction in headcount, no reduction in average paid hours, and you just and this kind of falls into that category of someone that had a lot of uncertainty, maybe when things started, or made the commitment from day one that they were going to keep everyone on, kind of no matter what, no matter where revenue levels fell to. If you fell into that category where nothing really changed from January 1st through the end of your coverage period, you can simply check that box and move on, because you'll have no reduction for FTE. And then there's a couple safe harbor calculations that you can run through. The first one is really you can avoid any calculation by simply representing that during the coverage period, you were not able to return to your prior period employment levels because of compliance issues. Whether it's social distancing, whether it's PPP equipment, whether it was space of your facility, whatever it was that you basically weren't able to return to that full head count. And I think this really is going to apply to again, those businesses that have capacity constraints, you know, that they're only open at 25% or 50%, and you really don't get back to 100% of usable capacity during your coverage period. And I think you're going to be able to use this safe harbor to not have any reduction related to FTE. You know, it really hasn't, there's really no guidance on exactly how you document this, but I think, you know, you're gonna pull, you know, the executive orders from the state, and you're gonna put your documentation case together that, you know, I'm this type of business, I fell within these kind of guidelines, which limited my capacity, and I just, you know, I couldn't bring back the number of people I had prior to COVID. The other safe harbor is it's similar than this. This was released with the original application. The only change is they moved the comparison date from December 31st or from June 30th to December 31st. So that June 30th date is no longer out there, and that's either on the 8-week or the 24-week. It just, the date was complete. The June 30th date was completely removed and replaced with the December 31st date. So I think that, and there was, and as we go over the application, there is some terminology in there that I think gives us a little more clarity, which we'll go over in a minute. So if you can make one of those three dates or one of those three check the box approaches work, simply check the box and you're done with your FTE test. If you don't, then you have to go back to the traditional, the original calculation, which is a simple, you know, division problem of what was your average FTE of your chosen prior reference period, you know, as compared to your coverage period. So one thing they did clarify on the coverage period, and again, you have three options there. It's either February 15th, 2019 through June 30th, 2019, January 1 through February 29th of 20, or if you're seasonal, you can pick a 12-week consecutive period between May 1st and September 15th. They did clarify that in the reference period, those are weekly averages. Those were originally laid out at monthly averages, and the most recent application has changed that wording to weekly averages. So both the reference period and the coverage period are now all weekly average calculations. So, you know, if you had 8 weeks in that period, then you just divide your weekly numbers by 8, and that's how you get your head count. So this area is unchanged other than the weekly definition change, and so this is what you have to fall back to if you don't meet one of the check the box options. We talked about the easy application. Again, that is pretty straightforward. It's been simplified. I'm going to pull up the original application that's been modified based upon the recent changes. And so there's just a couple things I want to, you know, point out as we kind of run through this application. So again, it looks very similar to the other application. Again, you know, the payroll cost here changes to 60%. And again, there's no cliff. It's just simply whatever your payroll costs are divided by 0.60. That gives you your maximum loan forgiveness amount. So if you only spent 40% on payroll costs, you can just take that number, whatever it is, divided by 0.6, and that just gets you your maximum forgiveness amount. So you get full inclusion of all your payroll dollars. So it's the same 2-page application as it was before, along with the Schedule A. The one thing that they did do, there's really not a lot of change. The one change I wanted to point out was in the Safe Harbor 2. And again, this relates to the Safe Harbor where you looked at your payroll on February 15th, and there was a 2-step process. One, you had to have gone down by April 26th, and then you have to restore, and here's where they added some language. You have to restore back to your February 15th payroll on the earlier date of December 31st and the date of the application. So you know, there was a lot of question on, well, do you need to maintain it through December 31st, or does restored or eliminate the terms that have been in the agreements? What exactly does that mean through December 31st? And I think they put a little clarity here where basically they've said the date of the application, whichever is earlier. So if you look at an example, if you were 100 employees on February 15th, and then you drop down to 50, during that period through August 26th, unless your coverage period ended, you took the 24 weeks and you ended, in, mid-August, even if your coverage period, calculated out at 75, you could still meet the safe harbor, let's say the week of October 10th, if your employment returned to 100, you could have, waited to file your application until that week in October. And then when you return to 100 employees, filed your application, you could check the box for the FTE and submit your forgiveness application with no reduction to your FTE for the FTE test. So that's one thing, again, from a strategy standpoint that you're going to want to keep an eye on where your counts are and how you're going to meet, meet that test. I'll also pull up the instructions and kind of walk through a couple of the updates on the instruction form along with that goes with the application. Just a couple things to point out. In the coverage period, you'll see the coverage period is defined as either 24 weeks or 8 weeks. And the 8 weeks only applies if your loan was in place before June 5th. So for any loans after June 5th, you simply have a 24-week coverage period. There's not an option for an 8 week. So you'll see on the application, you simply fill out your coverage period date range. So if you got your loan before June 5th, you have the choice to fill out that as either an 8 week range or a 24-week range. After June 5th, it has to be a 24-week range. So there is no check the box. You simply put in the 8 or 24-week range, depending on what your preference is. The same alternate payroll period applies to either the 8 or the 24 week. And again, that was to make things simpler. If you had a weekly payroll and you got your PPP loan funded on a Wednesday, you could simply start your payroll tracking in either the 8 or 24 week method the following Monday. So you could have complete payroll weeks included in your calculation. And this is a big question we're getting right now. Well, if I select the 24 weeks, can I file for my loan forgiveness prior to 24 weeks? And I'd say the answer is we're waiting for more guidance. It would appear that the application is geared towards a full 24 weeks because the FTE calculation for the standard way is based upon 24 weeks. So it would appear to be difficult. I mean, you couldn't calculate that unless you actually ran the 24 weeks. So that is something that we are looking for maybe a little more guidance on. If you spent your funds well short of the 24 weeks, is there a way that you could file the forgiveness prior to that? But at the minute, there doesn't appear to be that option. And I think we're just waiting for some clarification to see if there's a way to do that with this application. Let's see. Again, the divide by 0.6 for the payroll. Oh, sorry. And then another thing that they added was just on the compensation. As far as owners, they expanded from self-employed and general partners to also owners of S Corp. As far as not including the health insurance and the employer contributions, in that compensation as an additional amount. So again, you're just pulling through your self-employment income, which that was just a slight expansion on another group. So I think that was, let's see. And I think John already talked about kind of the safe harbor. We've talked about those pretty extensively, but again, they've put that additional language in there for the safe harbor. Here's where they changed the terminology, payroll per week on the prior periods for the comparison part of FTE. And that is, that's just a couple of the highlight changes that I wanted to highlight on the application. And so things that we don't know, yeah, we at the minute, you know, there's a lot of talk about what certifications are needed, and you know, loans over 2 million, they have said will be audited / reviewed, so that you know, the certification for need for under 2 million is still the same, that everyone who's in under $2 million loan is considered to pass that certification without any further review. You know, there's still another hot topic is the borrower's identity, how confidential that will be. That one has been, you know, kind of going back and forth about what level of information is going to be available to the public under the Freedom of Information request. And we still don't think that's been nailed down 100%, so that one's still a moving target. There has been some talk of automatic forgiveness for loans under a certain threshold, similar to the certification of need. But again, it's been talked about, but nothing really significant as far as a bill or anything like that. And then current, you know, the current IRS guidance on the deductibility of the expenses. So that is one that they're currently not deductible on a tax basis, and again, another hot topic that's getting talked about, and you know, people are wanting that to change as well. So those are kind of some of the things that we're keeping an eye out for, and I think the other one that we're keeping an eye out for is, again, someone who has the ability to maybe file for forgiveness less than 24 weeks, or you know, and any limitations on those forgiveness dollars if your dollars are spent well short of 24 weeks. So those are things, you know, the calculations are what they are today. You're either calculating all your costs on an 8 or 24 week, because that's the application and the guidance we have today. So we're just kind of keeping an eye open for any future changes with those areas. With that, we are going to pass this over to Susan to talk about a couple of HR issues.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm glad to be a part of this program. Always so much information. So my intent is just to talk briefly on some workforce planning options, and so wanted to share with you some of the things that you're all right in the middle of. We have had a look at all the different options. Many of you are moving back from a furlough situation, trying to bring employees back. Some of you have had employees working right along, and there's been a lot of questions around reduced work hours going forward. So what does a work share program look like? How do we make sure our policies for a remote workforce are in place? And what do we do about those employees who aren't ready or willing to return to work yet? So a lot of conversations around how do we make sure we can serve our clients and patients and have a full workforce ready to go as we're ready to ramp back up. One of the things that we see that's important is, it's a little bit of a delay here in my next screen. There we go, thank you. So what are the things we need to look at as we either continue our work or are in this reopening phase? And the biggest thing we're seeing right now is the need to comply with state and county orders. There's a lot of requirements out there in terms of what employers need to do for reopening. And keeping up with the Michigan executive orders has been a challenge for many employers, but necessary, as they've identified in that second bullet here, the COVID-19 preparedness and response plan. So a couple of requirements there that are absolutely necessary right now is that you have a written plan, you have a written checklist that you're following to make sure that all the things you're doing to keep your workplace safe, everything from protective equipment like face masks or shields or whatever your industry needs, hand sanitizers, that you have that identified. You have your workflow for people coming in and out of your space. You have the proper signage. That you also have training for when employees return so they understand their responsibilities. And thirdly, that you have somebody who's called a COVID-19 workplace coordinator or supervisor that can become the point of contact for those that have questions. Having your notices up, your model notices for the Family First leaves, those are important to have posted in a visual area where employees can see them. And then related to that, jumping across the way here, is do you have the policies written for those leave requests, whether it's an emergency family medical leave or whether it's a paid sick leave for somebody who's dealing with a medical diagnosis for themselves or someone else. So having those, the forms, the way you're going to document, the questions you're going to ask of your employees who may be eligible for those leaves clearly understood. So we have indicated with all of our clients that as you communicate with your employees, whether that was initially putting them out on a temporary leave or layoff, to now returning them to work, we're recommending that those all be documented so you can have a real nice chain of events of the things that you've asked your employees to do, that you can state what you've been doing to clearly have a safe workplace, that you are in fact ready to have employees return to work and what the employees can expect. That will help protect you and minimize risk as you go forward. We're knowing that there's a lot of still very fearful employees. There's a lot of savvy employees who may be pushing the extremes of not only coming back to work, not coming back to work, getting unemployment benefits. So clients are struggling with what's the best path for us to take. And I'm sharing with you that documentation for all these things and these steps is a good protection and clearly stating the expectations you have of those employees. Making sure that in any of your communication, you're identifying what's happening to compensation and benefits. We know that many employers are using the work-share program so that they can have the employees benefit from some paid time, a weekly benefit amount from the state, and then issuance of the extra $600 for the unemployment through July 31st. So understanding, just as the gentleman preceding me talked about, understanding your projections and what your revenue schedules might look like for returning your workforce back to work, a work share program might be that nice kind of win-win for the employer and the employee to both benefit from having the flexible schedule and having the employees have the benefit of the extra $600. And then lastly, how are you making sure that your employees are engaged, whether it's your managers who are now trying to manage a remote workforce or a mix of those on-site and those off-site? How do you make sure that there's team huddles, that you understand and employees understand the expectations of how to work in this new environment? So I call these the 7 key areas that you need to be thinking about. You need to look at employee handbooks and how do you update them with these policies that are changing and coming into play through the end of the year, and may have a longer term impact for you as a company. And so so much to consider. I think communication and dialogues with employees are key right now. Documentation, clarifying what the agreements are as we're working through these conversations with our employees will protect the employer and also help us make sure we've done our best to let an employee know that if they do not return to work, their benefit may be impacted and their unemployment may be impacted, because if there's return to work, the employees under the Department of Labor and under unemployment themselves believe they should be working without a justifiable excuse. Is that it? Did I have one more slide? Oh, very good. So sorry, very high level overview there, and certainly happy to answer any questions. I know there's a lot of planning that needs to go on, and clarification as we address individual questions from employees, but also look at it from an overall business.
Great. Hey, Susan, John, Tom, thank you for clarifying so many points and bringing so much information forward. We've scheduled about another 20 minutes of this program to answer the multitude of questions that have been coming in during the registration period and also during the webinar itself. If I could start with maybe if the four of us can have a general discussion on what seems to be the 600-pound gorilla in the room of companies that are in the position that I got my loan, I've spent it all or very close to spending it all, and I have the 60-40% nailed. Should I extend out to the 24 weeks or should I do the 8 weeks? Are there risks to either way? John, would you want to kick in first?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. That is a big question, and it's one of those, even if you don't have your full forgiveness spent already. Let's say you can meet all the FTE counts or you meet the safe harbors. So you're not going to get a reduction there. You're eligible for 100% forgiveness. And let's say that your payroll costs come in at 65%. So you've met that, but all of your payroll costs and your qualifying non-payroll costs, let's say it comes to 98% of what your beginning loan was. I've been looking at that and saying, why would you risk maybe running into some significant changes that haven't been brought forth yet? Could be more restrictive, who knows? You find that your FTE counts for some other reason all of a sudden fall off a cliff, and then you've got some other issues on the calculation. So yeah, I look at it as a bird in the hand's worth two in the bush. If you're either fully completely forgiven, or the calculation's going to go, or you're close enough to it to not worry about the difference in dollar amounts, why would you not want to take advantage of it, get that process started, get your forgiveness done, move on, and not be forced to any sort of additional restrictions as you move forward between now and the end of the calendar year?
Yeah, those regulatory risks that you discuss give me some flashbacks to some of the fairly decent sized changes various IFRs and FAQs have put us through over that wild ride that slide described in the beginning. I think when you see the SBA in front of a Senate committee and they're talking about revenue tests or profitability tests and the impact on potential forgiveness, kind of makes it interesting. Mm-hmm. Tom, along that way, say you're not at that 85-90% spend and you're not going to ring the bell at 8 weeks and you're committed to 24 weeks. 24 weeks is 3 times as long as 8 weeks. So you're going to be spending a good deal more on payroll costs. What would happen if during that 24 weeks I spend 200% of my PPP loan on payroll costs? What do you think of that?
Well, I think that's definitely, I'd mentioned about what the calculations sit like today. I mean, definitely if you were if you were a company that only needed a week or two more to get to your full, forgiveness spend levels, then, you're going to have a two times forgiveness number compared to your loan. So if that remains unchanged, that will give you the flexibility to maybe absorb a difference in the FTE account, because even if you drop 25% off your forgiveness, if you had a $2 million forgiveness number and a $1 million loan, you dropping 25% still keeps you above your loan amount, and that reduction for the FTE really won't impact you. So So that's kind of, the methodology, the calculation is now, the only thing, it just caution that, again, it's one of those regulatory risks. Is there a point where somewhere in the future they come back and say, well, if you spent it over 14 weeks, that's really where, your tracking of forgiveness dollars should end as well. But that's not in the current guidance, at the minute. So again, it's, ideally, if we could file for forgiveness with a safe harbor as soon as we're eligible and met the criteria, that would be a best case scenario. But there isn't clear enough guidance yet on whether that's going to be an option at this point or not. But hopefully an FQA will come out here fairly soon to maybe address that specifically.
Right. So I guess what I'm hearing from both of you is, depending on the facts and circumstances of the individual companies, really will drive whether to do the 8 or 24 weeks and what type of risks you want to potentially expose your company and yourself to. One of the questions that just popped up when I mentioned the revenue tests that might impact forgiveness. That was because a senator during the subcommittee hearing last week brought up to Secretary Mnuchin that he thought that these loans should only be forgiven if a company really needed the loan to survive. And the senator brought up the point of, well, what if a company had more revenue in 2020 than they did in 2019? Secretary Mnuchin, should that company be forgiven? And Secretary Mnuchin's response was basically, well, if a company did better in 2020 than 2019, he probably shouldn't apply for forgiveness. So comments like that make us concerned of changing of rules, because some of the rules and some aspects of this program were changed in April, some were changed in May, and they do bring impact. But the whole program so far has been, when you applied for the loan, you applied for it under the rules on the date your application was submitted, and we're assuming that's going to be the same way in forgiveness. So when John Priddian mentioned the bird in the hand versus two in the bush, that's the thought process behind it. To get to some more of the more exact questions, Tom, again, we heard the phrase owner-employee. We were very thankful when the FTE, or when the SBA actually defined what a FTE, a full-time equivalent employee, was, but then they threw in the phrase owner-employee, and on the last IFR, they actually said owner or employee of an S Corp. What are they? Are there guidance out? What should we be thinking about?
Yeah, unfortunately, they haven't given a threshold for owner on the forgiveness application like they did on the loan application. On the loan application, they wanted certain information for owners over 20%. They haven't given that direction or guidance on the application. So at this point, we're considering anyone with any type of ownership, any fractional ownership, would need to go on that line 9 for compensation and run through the ownership, calculation versus the worksheets A and B. So that's where we sit currently with the definition of who's an owner.
Okay. A corollary to that, say I'm an employee of my wife's company or of my mom's company. Am I an owner employee, or am I just another employee?
Again, that's another one that hasn't been clearly spelled out. There's obviously some concern that they might put some type of affiliation rule in for wages for family-owned businesses. But at this point, there's nothing clear that puts a specific measurement process in for family-owned businesses.
Okay, thanks, Tom.
That have members that aren't direct owners.
Right. John, here's one for you. Utilities is one of the forgivable expenses, but utilities could be imagined to be many things.
What is a utility?
Right. It says telephone, but do cell phones count? It says transportation, but does the gas I put in my car count?
Yeah, I look at that in similar to what we've been saying. There's not clear definition, but you would assume that, of course, gas, electric, water, any of those types of things. And in some cases, if you're using it's been said that in a trucking industry, fuel is considered a utility of your trucker. If you are a restaurant business, maybe the CO2 to run your soda machines and your beer taps, all of those things, could that be considered as utilities? Does the cell phone be considered, just because you're on the road salesman or use a cell phone instead of a telephone line, a hard line? Does that create any difference? My answer to that is twofold. Number one, first run the numbers. Run the numbers on your payroll, run the numbers on your non-qualifying payroll costs that we know specifically, the general utilities. And if you're already meeting the maximums on your qualifying non-payroll costs, well, why worry too much about the little details? If you still need to stretch it, then we may need to wait for further guidance on that. But I think it's safe to assume that the thinking, especially with the reduction in the payroll down to 60%, is that they're looking at adding, trying to provide easier forgivable amounts. And if it's a utility in a direct or ancillary part of your business, I think you should take advantage of including that if they have not specifically said it doesn't qualify. I mean, I think you can kind of use that guidance as long as it feels and smells like a utility in your business operation, including the rents. You should be including it until they tell you don't.
Great, thanks, John. That's great perspective and guidance there, and especially for those taking advantage of the 24-week period. It could get a little dicier on the 8-week period, but definitely good guidance there. Now, Susan, I have a HR question that was submitted. A practice has an employee that was terminated. When's the best time to pay that terminated employee's vacation time? Does it count as payroll for PPP forgiveness?
So anybody who is terminated would follow the company's policy. It relates to payout of earned or unearned, unused vacation. You would follow the company policy. But generally, if there is a payment to be made on PTO vacation time, then it's no later than the regularly scheduled payday for the period in which the term occurred. So immediately following. I would not recommend that the employer hold payment of that vacation till end of an unemployment July 31st, because that would be in violation of the FLSA guidelines.
Okay, thank you, Susan.
And yes, to answer further, I think Tom would agree that it is a payroll cost, so then that could be applied to the PPP loan.
Okay, and Tom, along that point, will accrued vacation payments for the termination and retirements be allowed in the calculation? And then also, should I use gross or net payroll when I use the money and when I calculate forgiveness?
Yeah, I mean, payroll costs, it's been consistent from the loan all the way through the forgiveness. It's a gross payroll number. So you're using your gross payroll number for your forgiveness, and that's going to include all these pay categories. You know, your vacation pay, your PTO time, you know, those. So someone leaves and has a rather large vacation payout upon when they leave. You know, that will qualify up to the 100,000 pro rata cap number. So again, that was 15,385 on the 8 weeks and a little over 46,000 on the 24 weeks. So as long as, you know, that payment fits within those prorated numbers, then it'll be an eligible expense. Now, if it puts them over, then any excess amount beyond those caps will be excluded for forgiveness.
Okay, thank you. John, during your presentation, you talked about how loans made after the PPP Flexibility Act was signed are 5-year repayment schedules. If I got my loan back in April or May, am I still on the 2-year? Can I get to the 5-year? Your thoughts?
I believe you're still under the 2-year. Tom, did we get clarification on that?
Yeah, any loan that was written and issued under 2 years, it needs to be mutually agreed upon between the lender and the borrower to change that to 5 years. So if you already had a loan issued at 2 years, you'd have to reach out to your lender and request a modification for 5 years, and that the granting of that modification is up to the lender. There's nothing in the bill that requires the lender to issue that to 5 years if it was already issued initially at 2.
Okay. All right. John and Tom, there are a number of questions from folks both submitted when they registered and also during this presentation referring to their PPP bank account. Now, I know some banks required their borrowers to establish a second bank account, but probably most didn't. And I think where it comes in is the documentation on the spend. The common theme during the questions was, hey, I spent something out of my PPP account, say over that $100,000 annualized limit for owners. Can I put money back in the PP bank account? You know, how does that look? Can you talk about some of the documentation and records our clients will want to have when we apply for forgiveness?
Yeah, sure. And the question really, it's important to know what your bank's going to want to see, right? Because if you're, every bank's looking at it a little bit differently. Some, as you said, required a separate account to be set up and this to be used as like a sinking fund, so to speak. As you spend qualifying money, you dropped it out of that account into your regular corporate account and spent it down. That seemed to be more in the rare side from what we'd seen in experience. Not that it wasn't there, but it just wasn't the majority of the banks. The majority of the banks, and the way the act reads is, it's your money, it goes into your general account. You have to track where that money is spent. And what we've recommended in many of the situations is, whatever works for you as far as tracking, it can be in your general ledger itself as you track things, to create a separate account for, you know, payroll PPP or rent PPP or utilities PPP, so that it's really easy to identify. Maybe even put as a different division so you can track it. Create an Excel template that starts with your, at least under the original, it was 75-25, and the loan was split up in the 2 amounts. And as you spent down, put it in the column and start tracking how much more you have to spend. Now it's 60-40. So depending on what situation you're in, you really just need to start tracking it, so that when you get 25% of the way through your pay period, if it's 8 weeks or 24, if you get halfway there, how are you tracking? Are you going to meet the 75% or the 60%? Are you going to meet the 25% or the 40%? How does it look? So that, as we've been talking about, it's so critical to understand your true cash flow and your true spend way before you're to the 23rd week or the 7th week, so that you can most effectively manage the opportunity to maximize your forgiveness.
Mm-hmm. So if I'm sitting there with my loan and I'm in the 7th week, or I want to apply as soon as the banks are open for forgiveness, Tom, can you talk about what your group has developed in the expense tracker and forgiveness calculator? So even if I'm just sitting on a pile of paper and receipts, I can work with that, or potentially compare to my own in-house built expense tracker and forgiveness calculator.
Yeah, but I think the key is, you know, we've developed a tool that just helps you aggregate into the right categories, and try to line it up with your source documents. You know, so you know your Blue Cross Blue Shield bills, your utility bills, your telephone bills, you know, all those things, logging them in, and so you can, at the end of the day, what you want is you want to aggregate a total for your coverage period for each line item on the loan forgiveness. Then you want to be able to support that amount with a detailed schedule and with copies. Each bank will have its own, you know, I think what you're going to see is a lot of the large banks are going to have an online portal, an automated type system for probably filling out the application online and then uploading supporting information. I think a lot of the regional and local banks, depending on their volume, will just use the application potentially the SBA has released, have you fill it out, sign it, and upload it with supporting information and schedules. So, yeah, I think it's just important to to be able to make sure that you can simply tie to the dollar amounts on your application. Because as we saw with the actual loan application, boy, if your numbers didn't tie out exactly on your application, or if the lender had a hard time figuring out how to look at your source data, so anything you can do to make that very obvious with schedules and the source document so they can clearly see how you calculated your numbers is really going to streamline your forgiveness process.
Yeah, great point. I would assume, Susan, John, and Tom, you would all echo that just as our clients, Raymond Business Advisors, were there to help in the application process, the forgiveness process is somewhat more complicated, and we're just as willing and able to work with our clients to maximize forgiveness as we did to maximize the loan proceeds. Would you agree?
100%,
Sure
110%. I mean, if you look back at what we did with the applications, everybody did with the applications, it was 3 boxes, if I remember right. It was your average monthly payroll times 2.5 and number of jobs. Yes, there was a lot of interpretation that went into that and everything that came out. But since then, it's all been focused on the forgiveness side, which is if you're gonna maximize the value of this loan opportunity, it's to maximize the forgiveness. And that's going to make sure you're jumping through all the hoops. You're making sure you're dotting all the I's and crossing the T's for fear of making one little mistake. Could be direct dollars that you are not getting as a grant. You're going to get in the form of a loan and have to pay back.
I guess the final questions that I'd like to address in the final 2 minutes has to do with the timing of asking for forgiveness. Back when this first started, back in early April, we were sharing best practices maybe 21 days from the end of your covered period for your loan. But with the FAQs and IFRs that come out, it's basically become an open question. I think the banks will be, for each of the lenders that they've lent to, will be talking about their own processes on timeliness. As of today, as we speak, the SBA has not established a process for banks to submit the forgiveness applications up to them. And I think most of the banks, if they are given guidance, are that they would be anywhere from July 1st to perhaps July 15th, that they'd even be able to accept forgiveness applications. Have any of the panelists heard anything different or more?
No, I think those date ranges are still, accurate. I think 2 other dates to consider is that, the current application itself, has an expiration date of, 10/31. And I think given the fact that the safe harbor on the FTE, goes all the way through 12/31, I expect that will be updated at some point, at least to be extended, 30 to 60 days beyond 12/31, to allow those that maybe are trying to get that safe harbor right towards the end of the year to qualify. They might be holding those applications. So I think we've got a general idea where the end date might be, but no specific requirement, at least at this point, on if you need to file it any faster than those dates,
Right.
10/31 or eventually early 2021.
So our clients shouldn't feel pressured that they have to get their applications in really soon, but they should be getting their information compiled and organized to apply when they want to, as soon as the gates are open.
I would say the only exceptions are obviously the easy applications or the 8-week applications where, it's a seems to be a fairly straightforward process to get the forgiveness, maximize the forgiveness. And you just, obviously there's a benefit if you get it in right away and you get everything forgiven. The sooner you're going to get a letter back confirming forgiveness, then that converts obviously from a loan into forgiveness on your financials as well, and that obligation, that note would be terminated. So I think for those people in those categories, getting the note terminated and getting it converted to forgiveness obviously is pretty important to get that done as soon as you can.
Yeah, that forgiveness is a good thing. Well, Tom,
Right.
John, Susan, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and business wisdom this afternoon. For everyone who's attended, thank you very much. We appreciate the trust you've placed in us. We look forward to helping you through the forgiveness process to maximize forgiveness for your companies. We will be emailing out the slides from today's presentation later on today, and there will be a recording at the website you see on your screen right now, raymond.com/COVID-19. Again, thanks for attending. I'm sorry if we were not able to get to your specific questions during this program, but I encourage you, please email, call, reach out to your Raymond Business Advisor with those questions and we'll get them answered. Again, thanks everybody and have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week. As soon as we get more FAQs and more guidance, we'll send you another invitation for another webinar. Take care, everybody. Stay well.